Excellent. Okay, so let's go through Mr. Taylor, and any questions you might have, you can direct to Mr. Taylor, and if we don't have answers, we shall seek those. So Paul.
Yeah, so thanks everybody. Thanks, Superintendent. I was asked to just give the very briefest of summaries associated with activities that have been occurring since the end of the legislative session. And I just, at the last second, I penciled down a few things to let you know that we're actively seeking reaction to how the legislative session went.
Hey, Mr. Call.
Oh, sorry. Some of those things include looking at the need to modify ARMS associated with law changes. We're also seeking to put out guidance for various bills. We're currently in the process of developing our legislative summary book that we provide after the session to help provide some guidance associated with the school associated bills. Some of you, I see there's quite a few of you on the line that I recognize names, and I'm happy to have you here. And just to let you know, your preliminary budget data sheets for the post-session will be out as soon as the governor is finished signing 3 particular bills that are associated with modifications on those data sheets. So the whole school finance division is rigorously attacking, testing that process right now. You know, I think I'll leave it there. I was also told, just as the superintendent indicated, that, man, that's a big heavy load to bear. If you have questions about bills other than the 2 bills we intend to directly review, direct them to me. My goodness. Anyhow, with that, I'd like to turn this over to Ken Bailey. We're going to discuss specifically House Bill 630 and House Bill 632, which describes how distribution for ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 funds are to occur. So if you will, thanks, Ken.
Good morning, everyone. As Paul said, we're going to go through the ESSER funding, both the federal side and what happened with the legislature. There are quite a few that did get pretty complicated. So Sarah, if you can let me share my screen now.
Okay, oh no, sure.
Thank you.
Make sure they can see that.
That's the wrong screen. Does it say budget? Oh no, are you seeing ESSER 1, 2, and 3 now? Okay, thank you. So so the agenda is to talk about a funding overview, then ESSER 1, and the bill that deals with that in the legislature is House Bill 630. Then ESSER 2 and the American Rescue Plan, as Elsie said, also called the American Rescue Plan Act, so sometimes ARPA, and House Bill 632 is mostly associated with that. And there, we have just gotten guidance from the Department of Education about a state plan and school plan and that kind of stuff associated with the ESSER 3 American Rescue Plan Act funding. So what I'm showing now is an overview of the funding broken down into ESSER 1, ESSER 2, ESSER 3, and then the total. And what happened in the legislature is that for ESSER 2, you can see that the base case for all of these is that 90% of the money must go to school districts on the basis of the previous Title I allocation. Then after that, the 10% that's left was reserved for the state to decide where the money could best be used. For the ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 monies, the legislature got involved and put into House Bill 630, then into House Bill 632, some direction on how those funds, the state funds, should be spent. And what you see here is the breakdown in broad terms of how that money is going to be spent. And I will say that this was the result of discussion and an agreement between the OPI and the MontPec group about what are the best ways to use the funds. And that's what's shown here. So for ESSER 1, you can see the total is $41 million. For ESSER 2, it's $170 million. And then ESSER 3, $382 million. So a total of $593 million from these 3 appropriations by Congress that are coming to Montana for K-12 education. And if you go down here, again, because ESSER 1 is involved, this wasn't done by the legislature, but we allocated $3 million specifically for special ed. The supplemental allocation to school districts was the part that in the ESSER 1, we said $10,000 as a minimum to each school district. In ESSER 2 and 3, we added a formula.
Ken, I think you muted yourself.
Have you guys heard anything?
Yes,
you
just up until about 5 seconds ago, Ken.
Okay. As the allocation of their educational institutions is the Montana School for the Deaf and Blind, Pine Hills, and the Youth Challenge. Special needs allocation, that's specifically in ESSER 2, is money that is meant to replace what would have been the inflationary special education for the coming biennium. Targeted support, Paul will talk about a little bit about what that means. Education leadership in Montana is the support that will come out of the OPI for the programs that are going oriented to teachers throughout. Very important OPI database modernization. You can see there's a total of $13 million. And the grand vision there is to get all of our systems talking to one another, easy to use, and having real-time data all the time. Administration is the maximum amount that the OPI can use for administering these grants. The next 3 are actually required in the ARPA money. State learning loss, this is out of the OPI 10% piece. And so this much is allocated for state learning loss, summer enrichment, and after school programs. I forgot to mention that in the basic allocation to school districts, the other wrinkle in ESSER 3 is that at the school districts, 20% of those funds must be used to address learning loss, is what the act says. And some work still to do that. And I'll point out to you that you can go to our website on the ESSER information page, and we have a spreadsheet that shows the allocation for all 3 funds to school districts, okay? So you can see the total amount that is coming to your school district from all 3 of these programs. And let me turn this over to Paul for the next 2 slides. Because what we did with House Bill 630 does get a little complicated.
Okay, sure. So House Bill 630, not only did it appropriate funds for ESSER 2, but it did a few other things. So it says, well, okay, let's just go through the bullet points. House Bill 630, it says, directs the use of 10% state reserve, meaning the full complement of ESSER 2 funding, 90% was required by the federal government to be distributed based on the Title I, a proportionment of the Title I allocation. The remaining 10% was at the discretion of the superintendent, and House Bill 630 provides the availability, the appropriation authority to make the expenditures, and specifically points out the items that Ken was showing in the screen earlier. So talking about directed is the 90%, the supplemental and subsequent line items there are the remaining things that were discussed in House Bill 630. shortcuts the normal path for enrollment increases. This is really referring to districts who have or can or would consider applying for anticipated unusual enrollment increases. This particular bill suspends any state funding associated with those for the next 2 years. So fiscal year 22 and 23, you can apply for an anticipated enrollment increase. However, there will not be any state support associated with that application. Rather, it changes the calculation for unusual, unanticipated enrollment increases to work through a new and different mechanism. And in the briefest of brief, I'll just bring it here, and I'm sure we'll have a follow-up meeting at some point, probably another webinar directly through the school finance division, in which we'll discuss it in more detail. Oh, actually, I'll discuss it more on the next slide, so stay tuned. Allows districts to use ESSER funds in place of base aid for enrollment increases. I think maybe I'll cover that in the next slide as well. It contains a formula for using FTE for allocating supplemental funds. That's correct. That's associated with the slide above, in which it discusses the supplemental distribution to schools. It does the distribution for that apportionment or that portion of funding is based on an FTE basis, but the FTE basis is modified from what it's not a flat rate. It is a school district with 6 or fewer FTE receives a flat rate of $10,000. Then every other district receives a averaged rate of all FTE across the state, plus $50 for every FTE it has less than the statewide average of a district's FTE. It's spelled out in the law, and I'm happy to go into it further if necessary. It designates state level ESSER funds in place of inflation for special ed allowable cost payments. So once again, the law outlines that we're going to make a distribution of a portion of the 10% set aside that would be comparable to that of which we would have distributed to the state district's general fund for inflationary purposes for the allowable cost payment. So instead, you'll deposit this portion of funding into your Fund 15 to be used for the purposes of the COVID-19 pandemic as described in the federal law. And then there's a formula for maintenance of equity protection. This is the very first section of the bill. What it states is, if the federal government determines that the way we are calculating maintenance of equity shows some form of inequity, there would be a subsequent payment to schools that are in that circumstance to their Fund 15 for general operations of the district. So these are all pieces and parts of the bill. It's quite a cumbersome piece of legislation. Let's take a few minutes and sort of focus in on the section of law that's associated with enrollment return. And here's an example to demonstrate. So, like I said earlier, the bill suspends anticipated enrollment increases and puts in a different mechanism for unusual, unanticipated return of enrollment. And in this example is a very light version of how it works. Let's say District A has a base budget that equals $1 million. That would be as of when you've adopted your budget this August, and potentially also when we release these post-session data sheets. So whatever base is equal to at that time. Then what we'll do is this upcoming October, when we get your enrollment counts in, we're going to, on the side, calculate what your base would be should the enrollment that materializes in October had been put in place of the previous October's amounts. And let's say that chugs a value of $1,100,000. What we'll do on a spreadsheet and provide to you on the website when this data becomes available is this information, but the next step would be to take the difference of the original base budget compared to what the upcoming base budget will be once we get your fall enrollment values in. What the law says in House Bill 630 is that is defined as funding that you could have coming to your district, but the law specifies first you subtract off any funding that is going to be allocated to your district under ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 from both the basic and supplemental portions. So in this case, I've added up the basic and supplemental of ESSER 2 and 3, and I'm imagining that they would have received $950,000. The law specifies that you take 10% of that value, and that is the amount of funding that you can use from ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 from the basic and supplemental to support general operations that normally would have occurred in your general fund. Rather, expenditures will be made from Fund 15 or your miscellaneous programs fund for that purpose. In this particular example, we're going to take the difference between the increase in your base budget of 100,000, subtract off the 95,000, and there'll be a remainder of 5,000 in this particular circumstance. It states in law that we will provide funding to districts in the amount of, in this case, $5,000 for this circumstance, first from one of the subcategories specified in House Bill 630, which is termed targeted support for school districts. So the $1.2 million is to help support circumstances like this $5,000. If we go through the full apportionment of the $1.2 million, because it is for the biennium, because the law suspends the ability to do anticipated for 22 and 23, if we happen to get through the $1.2 million, we'll still receive this additional funding to your Fund 15 for general operations from our base aid allocation through House Bill 2. I hope that wasn't too confusing, and I hope it was helpful. We will have a subsequent webinar going into detail on this, so I hope that's a good start. So Ken, take it over.
Yeah, I'll just add one note on this slide that's probably not obvious, but it's that $95,000. So basically it's saying you can take your ESSER funds and use $95,000 of your local allocation in place of the base aid that you don't get because of the increase. And a real important part of this is that the bill declares this is necessary because of COVID. And as such, you know, there's many of you I know that have given me a call or written to me and said, is this an allowable expense? And I'm like a broken record. I keep saying, how is it related to the COVID virus? And for this $95,000 example, that connection is made in this bill. So that for that portion of money that you spend, you can basically spend it on anything you normally do base aid for. And there's no separate responsibility to make a connection to the COVID virus. That's done by this bill.
And if I can hop in one last time, Ken, the targeted support funding that is provided to the district for the same purpose also is a portion of that bill. So agreed. Yes. Thank you for clarifying.
What I'm going to do now is turn to e-grants. Today is May 4th and ESSER 2 module is opening today. There is one caveat. We have held up on this because, we cannot distribute funds until the bill is passed and signed by the governor, because we need the appropriation from the state. And as of today, the governor has not signed the bill yet. And I don't believe that there's any issues. It's just that it physically hasn't made its way to the governor's office to be signed. But we're opening up today anyhow, but please recognize that we will not distribute any funds until that happens. So as we talked about, there's the base, the supplemental, and that special needs piece. And when you go into eGrants, you will see that there are actually 3 pots of money for you to draw from. And we're doing that because we kind of learned a lesson with ESSER 1 that when the department came out with reporting, it was really cumbersome. We had to ask the districts to do it, and it was tough. So this will allow us to keep up with what we believe the reporting requirements will be. The targeted support that was on the previous calculation page we'll do after the October count, and that will be a separate pot of money as well. You will also see that the purpose codes, when you create your budget, have been set to match what ESSER 1 was set up for, because what we're hoping to do is that this will be the reporting that USAID wants. And then instead of asking all of the districts to go into their accounting system and prepare these reports like we did for ESSER 1, we will be able to create this reporting based on the cash draws you make for those purpose codes. So keep your fingers crossed. As long as USAID doesn't change anything, the reporting to the Department of Education for ESSER 2 and then for ESSER 3, OPI will be able to do right from eGrants. There's also been an issue, and this will continue to develop, that a lot of planned uses of ESSER 2 and I believe of ESSER 3 will be for capital projects, either purchase of large assets or for construction projects like HVAC things. And there is a requirement, not in ESSER itself, but just in the uniform guidance about how federal funds are used, that you have to get that project approved by the state education agency before you begin it. And I have been doing that with emails from people and trying to keep up with those. But in eGrants, if you go to put something into the capital projects area, you'll get a separate screen that will ask all the things that we need in order to do this. So that then when we approve the budget, and this capital project screen will be included in that, that will represent the approval of the capital project as well. And it's all tied up inside eGrants. So opening today, and people can go in and start the process of creating their budget and start planning for withdrawals. Let me pause there. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you have anything, please do put it in the chat. Okay, how about ESSER 3? And again, we've called it ARPA most of this legislative session. The Department of Education came out with guidance and stuff, and they started calling it ARP. So I'll go with either one. And then HB 632 is associated with that ESSER 3. And again, it directs the use of the 10% state reserve. It has protection for failing maintenance of effort. And then there's a coordination with what Paul talked about, 630, for maintenance of equity. And I'm going to talk about maintenance of equity in a further slide. We also just got last week, as I said, USAID guidance that there's a requirement that, and what happened is with the ARP money, the Department of Education freed up 2/3 of the money to the states and reserved 1/3, and basically said we'll assign the remaining 1/3 of the ESSER 3 money after you submit a state plan. And so we've got some guidance on what that state plan should include. And there's also, we're really looking hard at what this means right now. There's a requirement for the districts to create a plan for reopening schools that's submitted to the OPI and then is published on the district website within 30 days of receiving ARP funds. And in kind of the classic, dealing with the bureaucracy, what does that mean within 30 days of receiving ARP funds? And so I actually sent that question to our grant manager in Washington and got a reply this morning. And Jay Phillips and I have both read it and said, what does that mean? So we're still studying that as to what that means in terms of receiving ARP funds. It's not the day that you receive your cash distribution. It's a step ahead of that, I believe. But again, we need to analyze that and give good, clear guidance, which I'm not ready to do at this moment.
So Ken, excuse me, there are some in the chat box. Let's go ahead and see what we've got here. It said they'd like clarification on the date. So with ESSER 2 is September 30th of 2023.
Yes, and for ESSER 3, it's 24. And again, it's because the grant actually says a year before that, but there's a thing called the Tidings Amendment that allows another year for this type of grant. And so it's actually a year later than what's actually in the act itself.
Thank you, Ken. There's another one from Roger that says, I heard the base budget calculation will be determined based on the 2.57% base entitlement increase that we originally were going to get the first year for inflationary purposes. Is that correct?
Paul, can I defer that to you?
Yeah, sure. Nothing in House Bill 630 specifies that inflation will be modified from what it was passed on Fred Anderson's bill, HB 15. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. And then Denise had a clarification. We know the ending date, but when is the beginning date?
So for ESSER 2, you can actually spend it on expenditures going back to, I think it's March 20th of last year. In other words, the same as what was for ESSER 1. And for ESSER 3, I think that's still true, but I'm not exactly sure. But for any prior expenditures that you haven't covered yet, the ESSER 2 money, I hope, would be enough to cover all of that. And then obviously from this point forward, any expenditures that you have, both ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 will be able to be used for it.
Thank you, Ken. Lonnie has said that they're being told that the law allows spending for ESSER 3 to 9/30/2025. Is that correct?
No, I don't believe that's correct.
So that spending of ESSER 3 goes till when then, Ken?
To 2024.
Thank you. And Tammy also says regarding capital projects with ESSER 2 and 3, you're going to approve the capital projects with the grant application, but what about petitioning to retain the asset?
I believe that's going to be included in that screen in e-grants.
Great. Mike has a question about the purpose codes. An allowable use of ESSER 2 funds is other activities that are necessary to maintain the operation and continuity of services in LEAs and continuing to employ existing staff of the LEA. If we just use the funds to keep existing regular ed, non-remote teachers employed, what would that be under purpose code 00 or other?
So I would have to go back and look at the purpose codes because the purpose codes are not now in ESSER 2 tied to the uses of the funds that are allowable like they were in ESSER 1. And so let me come back to you with more specific guidance on that we'll try and include with, because we're going to have follow-up training on e-grants that will, again, I'll come to at the end, and I'll make sure that we include that in that. Okay.
Thank you, Ken. And Alex is also asking that we drop the file of the district appropriations in the chat box. And everyone that's on here, thank you again for attending. Everyone that is here is going to be getting this recorded, as well as the slides, as well as any of the links that we have annotated here at that point. So any other questions for Ken or for Paul at this time?
I've still got a couple other slides, Elsie.
Thank you. Please continue, Ken.
Yep. So more of ARP stuff, okay? And I mentioned this before, of the base allocation to your school district, 20% must be used to address learning loss. There's also a new definition of state maintenance of effort. In ESSER 1, it was pretty easy. It was that the funding in the years of the grant had to be higher than the total funding that went from state to schools in the 3 years prior to the beginning of the grant. But now, instead of just being that, it's been changed to the amount of funding that goes to schools from the state as a percentage of total state expenditure. And because of that, we're kind of right on the edge in our projections. But again, I think the protection for that is being handled in 632 so that we make sure that we don't threaten the availability of these funds by not making maintenance of effort. There are 2 state requirements for maintenance of equity. The per pupil funding for high need LEAs. That means if you take all the LEAs and use the Department of Commerce poverty measure and rank them, then the top 50% cannot fall more than the state average. And then the per pupil funding for the highest poverty LEAs, which means you do the same thing, only now you look at the top 20%, that cannot fall below the 2019 level. And that really shouldn't be an issue because, as you know, we inflate base aid every year. But because of some things like 3-year averaging and considering changes in GTB and that kind of stuff, we discovered that it's possible that this could happen even though we're inflating base aid every year. And that's why we talked about the provisions that were put in to make sure that if, because of one of these calculations, maintenance of equity isn't met, then the state will provide the funding to make sure that the school district isn't threatened or that the state isn't threatened to lose this funding. We have also written to the Department of Education, and we know that the problems that we have occur in other states as well. And the Department of Education has promised that they will put out guidance on this maintenance of equity. So the resolution of this is still kind of up in the air, but the protection is in the statute so that we will not fail the maintenance of equity test, okay? There are 2 LEA requirements for maintenance of equity as well. So within your district, you take the total their per pupil state and local funding for high poverty schools, and it cannot fall more than the average of the LEA. And there's a definition of what a high poverty school is. And likewise, if you take the total FTE in each school and calculate it on a per pupil basis, then for those high poverty schools, they cannot fall more than the average. So there's both a funding test and an FTE test. And there is an exception written right into, there are exceptions written right into the statute, so that that test will not apply if your school district has less than 1,000 students. If you only operate one school, because obviously then there's only one school. And likewise, if all the students in a particular grade are only served with a single school. So if you have an elementary building and a high school building, then this maintenance of equity is really meaningless for you, because you're really trying to compare equity across cases of different levels of poverty. And the last exception is if there's something exceptional or uncontrollable, then we could apply to the Secretary of Education for an exception. So let me pause there again and see if there are any questions.
Ken,
And thank you, Kirk, for dropping that file. I'm a little challenged to keep up with all this and do that also. If the 20% learning loss is not met, what is the penalty? The department hasn't specified what the penalty is, but it's possible that they would ask you to return all of the ESSER 3 funding. But again, it's not definite. Every case, I think, would be something that would be considered by the department, because there's certainly no indication that the Department of Education wants to prevent schools from spending this money. Again, it's in the act itself, though, that the 20% has to be spent on this, quote, learning loss. And Superintendent Arnson has pointed out in many cases at many times, there is no definition of what learning loss is in the statute or that we can refer to. Any other questions? So again, we welcome your comments. As I mentioned, we're planning a follow-up because eGrants is going to look a little different in this module than it did at ESSER 1. We're going to schedule some training sessions for eGrants specifically of going through the screens and that kind of stuff. And we will certainly get that done by next week. In addition, Paul has been working on a document that goes into the details of all of this, along with guidance for the school districts on how to account for all of this. And we're in the process of getting that together. And we'll both post that and include that in some training that we do next week as well.
Thank you, Ken. There was another question from Ellen that said, when can we start spending ESSER 3 on learning loss?
So this is really a question of when can you, because I've talked about opening up eGrants for ESSER 2. Because of the guidance that came out from ARP, we're taking a look of, do we need to include anything else in the eGrants module because of these new ARP requirements. And so we have not said when we're going to open up ESSER 3, but it'll certainly be before the end of May. And in terms of when can you start spending it, you can start spending it as soon as you go through the eGrants process and are able to then create a cash draw.
Thank you. And I think you just answered Rebecca's questions that the ESSER 3 grants will be made available in eGrants before the end of May.
Yes.
Thank you. And I'm looking again from Alex. Does ESSER 1 need to be spent completely before 2 and 2 completely before 3?
No, when the acts first came out, and I think in some of the training that Mindy Askelson did, we were trying to maintain that basically from what I'd call a good housekeeping point of view of trying to make sure that the ESSER 1 money gets spent because it's the money that expires first. However, the requirement that you spend 20% of the money of ESSER 3 on learning loss means that for those school districts that think they'll have a hard time coming up with enough uses for that 20%, that anything that would qualify under that, it would be advantageous to take ESSER 3 money as soon as possible and use it for that purpose. So we're not going to restrict that you have to finish ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 before you can pull money on ESSER 3. What we will probably do is when we get to the end of this federal year, which would be at the end of September, is we may take the remaining ESSER 1 money and sweep it in eGrants into ESSER 2 so that it all becomes it becomes available in that module and still looks like a separate pot of money.
Thank you, Ken. From Roger, if you have employees working under ESSA, which are title programs, but don't have enough entitlement to cover those salaries and benefits, are the CARES monies a usable alternative, or do you need to meet additional requirements?
So again, I want to be careful how I state this because as I say all the time, the final opinion that counts is the opinion of your auditor when they come in and ask you how you have spent those CARES dollars. But in ESSER 1, everybody who went into e-grants and obtained money signed a certification that they will, to the fullest extent possible, keep all employees working. That was one of the goals of ESSER 1. So to the extent that you are in danger of having to reduce your staff because of funding, CARES dollars that's an allowable use of the CARES dollars. And again, I think the challenge comes then that come audit time, you have to be able to show that that's true, that that's the reason you used it for that reason, is otherwise you would have had to have reduced your staff.
Thank you, Ken. This also deals with learning loss. And since we don't have a federal definition and we don't have a state definition, it says, what if we have no learning loss in our small school? We were remote only 1 week this school year.
So that's going to be a real challenge. And, if we think that that's going to be a case that happens in Montana, I think it's incumbent on us at the state to take that back to the Department of Education and basically ask, what if this occurs? What happens? I don't know whether they would say then, well, then subtract 20% from the amount that the school district can get, or how exactly they'll address that with us. But it's not entirely our decision. It's in the language of the act itself.
Thank you for that. And I would not want any dollars going back to the federal government. I would want it to be a local control issue. So from Nate, it says, in a community that has low participation and free and reduced lunch program due to the conservative nature, but high poverty, is there a mechanism for taking this into account? Our ESSER allotments are far lower than average and our need is high.
This is a very complicated issue. When we did ESSER 1, we tried to make sure that we would give every school district at least $10,000. And we arrived at that figure by a past practice that we had with Title II. Mm-hmm. We don't have any choice about how the basic allocation happens. Again, it's required to be done on the basis of Title I. And based on some of the comments from ESSER 1, the minimum amount, we came up with a formula that tried to be fairer. But I guess what's always true is it's hard to come up with one basis that everyone in the state would say that's fair. Right now, what we described in the funding mechanisms today are all the funding mechanisms that we have for determining how much each school district will get. And it's really hard to overcome the fact that the intent for ESSER 1 and the other ESSER allocations in the way the legislation was designed was to be based on Title I, which is heavily allocated to high poverty areas. I'm afraid I just don't have a good answer for that.
Thank you, Ken. Martha is saying, do all public schools in Montana counties qualify for ESSER dollars?
Yeah, if you look at the allocation that we've done, every public school district in Montana has an allocation from ESSER 1, 2, and 3. For ESSER 1, we had, I believe, 4 school districts who decided, because you don't have to accept the money, and there were 4 small school districts who decided they did not want to receive that money.
Thank you. Denise says to please clarify, the period for allowable expenditures is established in federal legislation. So that's why folks are interested in the grant period beginning and end dates.
Yeah, so again, we'll publish that in our guidance for all three of these. And again, I'm not sure what you want me to clarify.
Ken, this is Denise. Can I just clarify? Would you mind
Yeah.
if I just speak?
Go ahead.
So earlier, this just caused me to ask the question, but you mentioned earlier that when eGrants is open and they can ask for reimbursement of expenditures, that's the first day of expenditures, but that's just the first day they can request reimbursement from OPI. Their allowable expenditure grant period is retroactive. I thought I heard you say earlier with ESSER
Yeah.
2 back to March of 13th, 2020. So I just wanted to clarify that when they get it in eGrants does not establish the first day they can spend the money.
No, that's correct. And
Okay,
again,
great.
by spending, I meant the date that they could actually get the funds and start making the accounting entries. But
Okay.
certainly going back and reimbursing yourself for expenditures that have already happened is acceptable.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Denise. And Martha also said that Deer Creek Elementary in Dawson County was not on the list.
We'll go back and look at that. Maybe that's an error, Martha.
Of course. And Martha's also saying that they're measuring learning loss by a criterion reference test that their students when they were before COVID. So that's just an opportunity for there. Excellent. I do, any other questions for Paul or for Ken?
If I may, Martha, try scrolling down through the document. I don't know if it's ordered by county or by LE number, but I'll verify for you for sure.
Thanks, Paul. So I do have Dr. Mergel on, and we are looking at that state plan because it's coming very soon that in the guidance documents that are still in comment. So I do have Dr. Mergel on at this point. And Julie, if you could just share where we are at right now.
Sure. Thank you, Elsie. Yes. So so effective April 22nd, interim rule for the ARP ESSER 3 funding was put out. And the department the purpose they're trying of the interim rule currently is to promote accountability, transparency, and effective use of ARP ESSER funds. And so there's kind of some rulemaking happening, and it's due, any comments are due by May 24th. And throughout this process, it requires meaningful consultation. It's asking us to submit a state plan by June 7th to the department. That does require some of that meaningful consultation and public input. So we will be in contact with our schools. We will be in contact with our partners as we seek input on this state plan. And I guess I would say that I think one thing to mention to you that's really important that you should have received last week, our superintendents and our principals, was an opportunity to learn survey. And we're really asking your support in doing that survey because there's a lot of information and data within that that can support us in guiding our state plan. So if you have not got that opportunity to learn survey, please let me know, reach out to us here because we do want to be sure we send those with links that are designed particularly for schools so that we can really give you back even some data so that you can be using that as well. So if you have not gotten that information, please do reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat box here, but we're asking for your support on that because that has some critical data that can support us in development of these SEA plans, and then will help us later with the LE plans. We don't know what kind of information we'll get back from the department on May 24th. And as Mr. Bailey has shared with you, There's a lot still happening as we go back in. We've got a lot of questions into the department seeking further clarification. And so we will be in constant communication with you. But I do look forward to sending out some information to gather your input from all of our different stakeholders. The things that Mr. Bailey has even mentioned, the department is currently saying that there's 2 types of LEA plans that are going to be required. One is a reopening plan that will need to be posted publicly on websites 30 days within allocation of ARP ESSER 3 funding. But there's a second one that comes 90 days after the allocation of an LEA plan for ARP and ESSER funding, and kind of outlines that 20% and some other components. So we'll be working, reaching out. Things are kind of just evolving. We'll be in touch of what that would mean. We want to really be able to support you guys so that it's not another plan and another set of accountability, but rather how do we fold this all into eGrants and make this really meaningful and manageable for you. So as this stuff has kind of been happening and moving, like I said, it's evolving quickly. We're anticipating ongoing conversations with the department between now and May 24th, and working very diligently to get a state plan ready to go. That is a Montana plan and is built from that Montana perspective with local control and as much flexibility as we can provide. So I guess, Elsie, that's what I would say. Stay tuned. More information coming. We'll be reaching out for that meaningful consultation. In the meantime, please, if you can support us in getting that opportunity to learn survey data in, that will help us as we look at these plans.
Thank you, Julie. And because the state plan is also parallel to the school plans, we want to make sure that we work in tandem together. I want to support schools as much as possible. I firmly believe in local control. I firmly believe that we do not want overreach in the development of the plan, overreach into if they approve or disapprove of the plan from your standpoint, as well as from the state. So there'll be more that will come. And as Ken had said, there'll be something next week. This information that was on here will be readily available to you along with the links that we had. And please do, when you do get that opportunity to learn survey, take a look at it. If you have any questions, Dr. Mergel is here for any answers that you might seek. So I know we have a Board of Public Ed meeting next Thursday and Friday, and there will be some discussion as we get further understanding from the Department of Education. With that, any further questions you might have of myself, of our CFO, Ken, or of anything dealing with any of the legislation that we discussed in the ability for ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. There is one that just landed in the chat box. Let's go back to that real quick. It says, this is from Dustin. Could you help me understand why a district would not receive any supplemental ESSER 2 or ESSER 3 allocation per allocation sheet on the OPI website as defined in House Bill 630? Thank you, Dustin.
Paul, do you want to take that one or do you want me?
Sure. Hi, Dustin. I believe all 400 operating LEs are receiving some form of ESSER 2 or ESSER 3 funding on that sheet under House Bill 630 and House Bill 632. If that's your question, I suspect maybe it's not. I'm wondering if your question is more closely associated with the 10% use of the basic and supplemental funding. And if so, maybe give me a call and we can discuss it further if that's what you're after, or type it in the chat box or bust in and just say it.
Paul, I think the question is if on the allocation sheet, the amount of supplemental is 0, why would that be? There's lots of schools that don't get any supplemental because they already are above the, yeah.
Yeah, specific to that supplemental portion. Oh, right. Right. The calculation in law specifies that It's first 10,000 and oh boy, you got me, Dustin, sorry. Yeah, so then we're going to take an average. Oh, I know why. There's a cutoff associated with a measure. You take the amount of 90% that you receive in its proportion compared to, there's a, boy, I'm gonna have to just simplify and say for now, if you receive a certain proportion in the basic funding, you don't qualify for the supplemental, according to that section of law. Again, maybe we should talk more later if necessary. I'll brush up before our next meeting. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Dustin. And because of the state action with it, the law is relatively new, so we're still working through this, but thank you for that. I don't know if there's any more questions in the chat box, but I do want to say this, you know, if there's any way that we can take things off your plate in that LEA plan, we're trying to make sure that the grant programs and everything will have the information so that we can use that rather than having to go to you for another data point. Everything that we are doing is trying to have you be the customer and have us be the one that interfaces with the federal government on this, as well as with the legislature because of the action of these two bills. So it's going to be a very interesting rest of May, as well as going into the summer months as we get more clarifications. So we're here to serve you. We're here to answer any questions that you might have. And I thank you for being on this hour-long conversation. There'll be another one that will come from us next week for clerks to make sure that you have an understanding of what that e-grant application looks like as it is open today. So with that, I wish you all the best. And I thank you very much for, as we close this very uncertain school year, celebrate with your students, your staff, and of course with your communities. And we are blessed to be here in Montana. So thank you all. Stay well.